Buenas noches a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We have the great pleasure today of having Amor Towles and in a chat with Inés Martín Rodrigo, two people who are in love with stories and who I'm sure will have a very interesting conversation. The publisher of Mr. Towles and Ms. Lapointe and myself fell in love with his work, and I won the fight, and I bought his first book, Rules of Courtesy, and we are very proud of having this book with us. He always surprises us, he always invents a new world and leads us through new paths, as you would probably have learned with The Gentleman in Moscow, and as you will see today in the Lincoln Highway. I hope you all enjoy this chat.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Sigrid. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much, Sigrid, and thank you, of course, to Salamandra Publisher. And also thank you to Fundación Telefónica. I always say this, but it's very interesting to see that this is a full hall today to hear us talking about stories, about literature. It's always a great pleasure to see that so many people are interested in this sort of events. So thank you to all of you who are here today, and thank you to all of you following us in streaming. And also thank you to Amor Towles for letting me be here with him, accompanying him in the presentation of his novel here in Spain. Salamandra published the novel last 31st of August. It was the first, one of the main courses in the publishing world in our country. It's already proven to be a great success among publishers, among readers. Those of us who work in the world of literature, we know that life is just a viewpoint, that there are so many viewpoints. It may be infinite perspectives, as there are as many as people make part of this finite narrative that is our existence. This is the premise that serves as a basis of this new novel, The Lincoln Highway. He's the latest novel of Amor Towles. Towles was born in Boston in 1964. He is one of the main characters, of the main figures in the Anglo-Saxon literature of our days, although he arrived at literature somewhat late. He published his first novel that he mentioned, that Sigrid mentioned earlier, A Matter of Courtesy, in 2011, while he had little time because of his work in the world of finances. That wonderful work had a great success. It was an unexpected success, but it was not just a strike of luck, or it didn't happen by chance. Towles had very clear in his mind that he wanted to become a writer since he was in primary school, although we will talk about this further in a few minutes. In 2016, he published his second novel, A Gentleman in Moscow, of which Sigrid has also told us before. This is the main protagonist is an aristocrat who is forced to live in a hotel by the Bolsheviks. In the Lincoln Highway, Towles takes us to the United States in 1954, and he takes a giant narrative leap because there are 8 different voices in this book, in charge of telling us the story of a group of young men passing from youth to their adulthood. So, hello, Amor. My first question has to do with the last thing I just mentioned, the age of the protagonists of your novel, The Lincoln Highway, since one of the main topics in your novel is the meaning, or what it means to be 18. Why are you interested why are you interested in that particular age in your narrative?
Thank you, Inés, for the conversation tonight. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. In answer to the question, at the center of my new novel are 3 18-year-old boys who are making a journey over 10 days between Nebraska in the American Midwest and New York City. What is it about the being an 18-year-old that I find so compelling? And it's that I think all of us, anywhere, forever, when we were born to the time we were 16, we are constantly receiving instruction from our parents, from the schools, from church, and these instructions that we receive are meant to shape who we are. They are telling us how the world works, what we should expect of ourselves, and what the difference is between right and wrong. But when we get to 17 or 18 or so, I think we all go through an awakening in which we realize that all this information we've been receiving, all this instruction, we don't have to take it at face value. And in fact, we can reject much of it because we realize that we have the liberty to make all of these decisions ourselves. We have the freedom to decide how does the world work, what should we expect of ourselves, who should we associate ourselves with as friends or lovers or what have you, and ultimately, what do we think the difference is between right and wrong? And so in this story, which only lasts 10 days, we are looking at sort of a moment in which all of the main characters are kind of beginning to go through this transition, where they're considering aspects of their past and weighing whether or not they should continue those aspects into their future, or they're rejecting aspects of their past and beginning the process of deciding how the world works for themselves.
Ya lo has dicho.
You've already said this, the story of Emmett, Billy, and Duquette, and Gully, and Sally takes place only during over 10 days. Now let's move to the origin of the story. I think it was in the first 24 hours when you decided that the story would take place in over these 10 days, and that it would also start in the Middle West and in Nebraska, and it would end in New York. And please let us know how this idea came about and how you had it so clear in your mind, all these particular aspects.
Okay. So I've written fiction since I was a boy, and over the course of my life I've had many ideas for stories or books, novels. And the ideas generally come, as Inés was saying, in a like a sentence, just a notion. And in the case of this book, where I began was I sort of had this idea of, I'll tell you how the story begins to set this up. Before the book begins, our hero, Emmett Watson, goes to a county fair with his younger brother. He's 17 at the time, and a bully picks a fight with him. He punches the bully. The bully falls back, hits his head, and dies. And as a result, Emmett is sent to a juvenile work farm. The book begins the day that he has finished serving his time, and the warden is driving him home. Now, his mother is long gone. While he was doing time, his father has died, and the family farm is in foreclosure. The banks now own it. So his intention is to get home, pick up his 8-year-old brother, get his car, a Studebaker, and drive to California. But it turns out when the warden drives away that 2 of his friends from the juvenile facility have hidden in the trunk of the warden's car, and they present themselves with a very different plan for what Emmett should do next, basically taking him east to New York. So this is sort of how it begins. And the notion that struck me many years ago, 15 years ago, was this image of the young boy being driven home by the warden and 2 friends from the juvenile prison being hidden in the trunk of the car. That's where I started. I have no idea where that came from. But when a story like this, a notion like this grabs me, I just keep thinking about it. And over a period of 5, 6, 7 years, I'll imagine everything in the book. I will imagine the characters and their backgrounds, their families. I'll imagine all the things that happen to them, the settings. Ultimately, I'll imagine what they sound like as people. And only when I have sort of a very detailed understanding of everything that's going to happen in the book do I begin the process of writing it. At that point, I draw up an outline and I start chapter 1. So it is this kind of long process, but really, the original notion for this one, I have no idea where it came from.
Cuéntanos.
Please tell us now why you choose that particular date or that particular year in particular, and why 1954, why that year in the history of the United States, and why not 10 years earlier or 10 years later in the 60s, which is such a fundamental decade in terms of the culture and socially speaking.
If you think of the late 60s for a second, I think we all have an image of what was going on in America at that time. You had a very active civil rights fight going on in the United States as Black Americans sought equality in American society. You had the beginnings of the feminist movement, really, as young women, middle-aged women began to reject the way that society had required them to live in the 40s and 50s, and began seeking their own independence, freedom of action, a voice in society, a place in business, etc. The sexual revolution kind of takes off in the 60s as people, particularly young people, decide that they should sort of have the freedom to pursue love and affection however they want, when they want. They shouldn't have to wait till they're married or what have you. And the youth movement is really big and taking off in the United States. And the youth movement, which is tied to rock and roll in many ways, is an ongoing protest movement. Protests against initially the Vietnam War, protests against racial inequality, protests against all kinds of institutional control, whether that's in the government or the schools or their parents. And you have youth gathering in large groups across the country, like at Woodstock, sort of proclaiming their independence and wanting to set a new direction for the country. So all this is going on in the 1960s. Now, what's interesting about 1954, when this story takes place, is that none of that is on the surface of American life, but all of it is about to happen and is just under the surface. All of the things that are going to cause these revolutions are there. So the inequality in terms of race, the tough position of women, the frustration of teenagers, it's all there simmering, waiting to come out. And rock and roll is actually invented in that year of 1954. Mm-hmm. So that's what's sort of interesting for me, is to set this story, these activities of these young men, of the young woman they know, of the young Black American they know, at this moment when everything seems quiet and clear and safe, but in fact, all of the turbulence is right there beneath the surface.
Sigamos en el año 1900.
Let's stay in 1954. That year, most of the protagonists are becoming of age. They're turning 18. I think that's also the year in which your father also turned 18. And if you want to elaborate on this, you found out later this is not something that you had actually foreseen or planned. It was just a coincidence. Emmett and Billy, the brothers who are the protagonists of your novel, as you say, they have just lost their father, and they go to look for their mother towards they're aiming for California, although there are so many things that are going to interrupt this trip. But how would you say the relationship between parents and children is present in your novel, and to what extent or what influence does this have in the relationship among the friends themselves?
In this particular story, in the 10 days, there are no parents physically present. So none of the characters really do you see their parents. But as you get to know the various characters, you will learn a great deal about their parents. As we hear their memories or their reflections, or we gain knowledge about their upbringing, their youth. It is central to the story that while these are young men and a young woman beginning to sort of express their own independence, their decisions and their state of mind is highly influenced by the decisions their parents made, because they've inherited those decisions, either as strengths or as burdens, if you will. And Inés is right, that I had written about 80% of this book, and all of a sudden it occurred to me, about this bunch of 18-year-olds in 1954, and all of a sudden it occurred to me, I was like, I think my father was probably about 18 in 1954. So I went back and did the math, and sure enough, that's when he turned 18. And it was so obvious in retrospect, because I felt very comfortable telling this story. I'm not a research-driven writer, so it felt very natural for me to tell this story. Well, of course, the reason it felt so natural is that we are all very affected by what happens in the world when we're, young, between 6 and 16. What happens in the world politically and economically and culturally at that time when we're so impressionable, that will affect us in ways that will shape the rest of our life. It'll shape how we see the world and what we think is going to happen, in the way that if your parents were born in the Depression, they never forget the Depression. It continues to affect the way they live their lives long after the Depression is over. So what's interesting, I think, is that while this seems kind of obvious that we're affected by the way the world is when we're young in a lasting way, I think what we are, the period that has almost as much influence on us is the period when our parents were young, because that's a period that shaped them, and they're constantly telling us about it. They tell us stories about when they were young and about the way the world was when they were young, but also when they tell us how things are, the way they should be, or what we should expect, it's being influenced by those memories. And so it felt very natural for me. We know more about our parents' youth than we think we do. If we go back and sort of dwell on it, we can fill in a lot of the blanks without having to call them, And so it felt very natural for me to then tell this story. As an aside, once I realized this, the hero Emmett Watson's birthday gets mentioned late in the story. And so I went back and changed his birthday to be the day that my father was born.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because, why not? It seemed like a natural thing to do.
Ya que había...
Since that coincidence was already there, let's take it to the fullest, right? Let's go back to the story, though. Going back to 1954, that's the year where the story takes place, but the rules of civility was placed back in the 30s, and A Gentleman in Moscow, your second novel, was took place during the Russian Revolution. So I'm very interested in learning how you relate as a writer with your own story, because as a reader, this is as if the story from the narrative viewpoint was there, but not from a practical viewpoint, but instead as if it were a sort of a background or a very secondary character that you use in order to tell the rest of the story that really interests you.
Okay. I think that you're right about that, and so I'm going to elaborate on this. In a way, what I'll answer is, what is the role of history in my work? Because yes, I wrote this book in the 30s about a young woman in New York, and then I wrote a book about the Soviet era in Russia, and here's this book about 1954, and my next book begins in Cairo after the end of the Second World War, and then ends up in New York in the 90s. And so it's a reasonable thing for someone to ask, what do I think about history in my work? And here's the best way that I can describe it for you, and it's by a parallel. So imagine that you are all in a theater right now, a dramatic theater. You're in the seats, and what you're looking at is the stage. And let's say it's a play by Chekhov, like The Cherry Orchard. And on the set, you can see the living room of a beautiful, wealthy country estate in Russia, the Russian countryside. Now, at the back of the living room is a pair of French doors. And through the French doors, you can see the actual cherry orchard in the distance. It's spring, the trees are in bloom, so you can see the white and pink blossoms in the afternoon light, shimmering in the wind, right? That's what you see. Now, of course, when you see this cherry orchard in the distance through the French doors, what you're actually looking at is painted canvas, because that's how you design the back of a stage set. You paint the illusion of space. Now, when the crew paints that cherry orchard, they're going to hang in the back of the stage, they're not going to paint it in a hyper-realist style, because that would look weird to the natural eye. Instead, they're going to paint it in an impressionist style, like in the manner of Monet or Renoir. And this is important because by using the techniques of Impressionism, the sort of fuzzy quality of brushstrokes, that's going to give a more accurate depiction of what the trees look like in the distance. We almost can see the movement of the blossoms, and we can see the shifting light, and that's really what we're looking at. Now, in front of the French doors, in this room, we have bookcases that have been built out of cheap wood, but have been painted to look like mahogany, to make it look like they're fancy. And over here, there's a staircase that goes nowhere, and over here, there's a door that goes nowhere. It's a stage set. But in front of those things is an actual table surrounded by actual chairs on which there is an actual China tea service. Now, this is very important that these things be actual, real. Because let's say a sister is sitting at the table having tea, and when her brother comes out to speak to her about something that he's upset about, let's say, and he pulls the chair back and sits down and pulls himself up to the table, we want to hear the scraping of the wooden legs of the chair across the wooden surface of the stage. And when he makes a point by, slamming his hand on the surface of the table, we want to hear that physical contact of his hand hitting the table. And when the sister patiently puts down her teacup, we want to hear the clink of the cup in the saucer. And now this is all very important because it sharpens for us, as members of the audience, the focal point of the drama of the play, of where our attention is turned. Okay, so this is the way that my work is structured. And history is the painted backdrop at the back of the stage. It is not designed to be hyper-realistic. It is drawn in an impressionist style to give you a sense of time and of place and of mood, and that's plenty. Now, in front of that in my work is a lot of cheap wood that's been painted to look like mahogany, like the bookcases. And that stuff is, if you've read my work, tends to be things like moments that are described in detail where you ask yourself, did that really exist? You know, did that club exist in New York? Did that wine cellar exist in the hotel in Moscow? And that's great. I don't want you to know whether it existed. I want you to be wondering whether it's real or not, this plywood painted to look like mahogany. But in front of all that are the table and chairs. And that's really where I'm focused as a writer. And I want that to be so real to you as you read that it feels like you're sitting at the table with the brother and sister. And I want you to feel like you know them well enough that you can hear the tone of voice as they exchange their ideas and sentiments. I want you to be able to interpret the expressions on their faces. I want you to have all of your attention in a way on the activity around that table, because ultimately that's where the action is. That's my long answer to that question. Thank you.
Diremos que además
We will say that without revealing anything else, there's a character that connects rules of civility with the Lincoln Highway. We won't go any further. We will keep it at that. For those who have not had the chance yet to read your latest novel, let's go back to the story in the Lincoln Highway, and let's go back to the beginning of our conversation. I mentioned the way this novel has been structured with 8 different perspectives, 8 different voices, and I'm very interested as a writer and as a reader, how did you find these 8 different voices? Because it's really challenging for the writer to build 8 different voices and for them to be really viable, credible by themselves, and that they are sustained all throughout the narrative. How did you get to these 8 voices, 8 different characters? Obviously the protagonists, but also Ulysses, who is this character that I really appreciate, the priest, who I like a little bit less. How did you get to these voices and why?
You're right to focus on that. I mean, I appreciate that, because it is one of the most important challenges of writing in general, but writing this book in particular, which is capturing a voice of a character. Now, you can write in an omniscient style, which I don't tend to do, which would be like in Henry James or Tolstoy, where the narrator knows everything. They know, all the characters, what they think, what they don't say, what they dream about. They know what happened to the characters in the past and what's going to happen to them in the future. And it's kind of this powerful, universal knowledge of a voice which delivers the story. Now, as I say, I don't tend to do that. And what I'm much more interested in for now is writing that is the expression of the internal reality of a protagonist. So if you've read The Gentleman in Moscow, I would hope that you have a sense of that the majority of the book, while it's third person, is really an extension, an expression of the internal life of the Count. We hear his sensibilities, his observations, his influence by his memories, his ideals, and ultimately his language and his sense of humor, etc. So I'm interested in doing that and bringing events to life for the reader by, through language, giving the reader access to the internal life of the key characters. And what makes the Lincoln Highway a little different is I decided to do that from 8 different perspectives, so that you would hear the internal life of each of the 8 key characters here as events unfold. And many of the events are shared, meaning that you might have 5 of the characters witness the particular event. And the question becomes sort of how they might see that event differently. So as the story is going, the challenge for me is to make sure that each of those 8 voices, each of those 8 different narrators, as it were, is distinct, and that they're true to the individual characters. So going back to Inez's question, how do I do that? Well, if I succeeded, I guess I should say. But okay, all right.
Okay.
But how do I do that? Well, I've been writing since I was a boy, as I said, and my training, as it were, was really in the process of writing many, many, many stories from different perspectives. So that was what I loved to do. I would write a story from the perspective of, a young woman in Berkeley, California in the 60s, and then I would write a story about a violin repairman in Vienna in the 19th century, and then I'd write a story about a young black boy in the South in the 1930s. I would be constantly shifting, because what then I would be asking myself is, as I'm telling this little story of some incident that happened to this character, is what should this sound like? If I were that individual, what would be my vocabulary? What would be the pace in which I describe things? How would I use metaphors, if at all? Would I make allusions to the world or literature or music, if at all? And eventually, what is their semantics? And I would sort of circle around until I really felt like I had their voice. And then that is really what I use to write the story, such that hopefully the events of the story matter, but in a way you learn more from how the character is describing events than from the events themselves. That's where you really get the insight into their emotional state, their psychological state, how they're changing, etc. Now, so in this case, I have these 8 characters I have to do this for. So some of this is second nature to me because of all this practice, as it were. But in each case, it still requires discovery. So I will take a character, like Duchess, and I'll have some ideas about who he is. He's a kid who's raised in a tougher part of New York. His mother's died when he's young. His father is an actor, a failed actor, who ends up being kind of a drinker and a con man, but doing Shakespearean monologues on vaudeville as vaudeville declines. So I now I'm beginning to get a sense of Duchess. This is how he was raised. And he's not very well educated, but he's heard the Shakespearean monologues 1,000 times. So he has this kind of mix of a lack of education, but yet Shakespearean language in his mind, and he's kind of lived in a hard Scrabble environment. So that's a start. But then what really happens is I'm going to discover who Duchess really is through the writing. I know what's going to happen to him, but when I actually sit down and he starts to describe events, that's where you start to circle in on, this is the guy. And that takes, I might write 5, 10, 15 pages until suddenly I'm like, oh, wait a second, now I'm really hearing the personality, as it were. And then you got to go back and start again and work forward such that you constantly have that personality at the center of driving the narrative whenever Duchess is in the room, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Me voy a detener en...
Let me stop at a character that I really love. His name is Billy. For those of you who have not read the novel, it is an 8-year-old kid who loves reading. He's in love with literature. And over these 10 days that the trip lasts, he keeps reading a book in which he discovers the stories of great historic heroes and literary heroes like Ulysses coming back to Ithaca. So let me ask you, Amor, what is it with that character? What does he have of the kid that you were once?
Oh, that I? Oh, me. Oh, okay. Well, I'll start with the character. I'll have to think about myself. This is a story where, as I said, we've talked about, there's this group of 18-year-olds. There's really about 5 of them that are at the center of the story. But in addition, there are some older people. Ulysses, who you've mentioned, who's a veteran of the Second World War. Pastor John, who's sort of an old and wily and dangerous preacher. And Abacus Abernathy, who's an older storyteller, as it were, quite in his 60s or 70s even. Sarah, who's the sister, the older sister of one of the characters, and is a married woman and living in the suburbs. So you have the 18-year-olds, you have sort of a small universe of adults that you're going to encounter. You have the memories of parents, or the sort of the presence of parents, as we've talked about earlier. But in addition, you have this 8-year-old boy. And what I think is interesting about Billy as a character in the context of this story is that he brings into this community of young adults and older adults, he brings into the community of adults all that a young person would, which is, innocence, a sense of wonder, a curiosity, his own obsessions, which he'll show up with and share, sort of a sense of common sense, right? As he looks at the world, he has a sort of a bit of common sense. All these little things, openness to strangers, friendliness towards others, all these things that children will tend to have. And I think what's sort of fun in the case of this story is that all of the older people and the younger adults, they are beginning to be affected by what all adults are affected by. Whether that's their own concerns, their own suspicions, their cynicisms, their goals, all these things that we as adults carry with us and that in a way make us a little sharper, make us a little bit more driven, make us a little less exposed to surprise or kindness or wonder, or all these magic, if you want to call it that. And so what you have is this young boy who brings that energy into this universe of older people with all their plans. Everybody's got their plans. And you get to watch as his innocence and wonder affects each of them, such that whatever they thought their plans were yesterday and whatever they thought was important yesterday gets shifted to some degree by their encounter with this, but with young innocence. And I don't think, Billy's a magical figure in any way. I think that this is what young people do for us, and this is what happens when we first become parents, right? Is we suddenly have this shocking memory of like, oh my God, our 7-year-old or 6-year-old, you can't believe what they just said, or what they say when they go to a museum, or what they say when they go to the park, and it sort of brings back for us an aspect of ourselves that we had been kind of paving over in a way. And so Billy is sort of rejuvenating in a way the mindset of all the characters in the book, and as a result has big impact on what happens in the book as the others make decisions under his influence.
Mm-hmm. Ya para terminar.
Just to finish, before we open the mic for the Q&A from the readers that accompany us here today in this Espacio Fundación Telefónica, I would like to talk about the Lincoln Highway, which gives the name to your book. And I have to confess that I discovered it thanks to this novel. I didn't even know of its existence. It's the oldest highway ever built in the United States, and it crosses the United States from the east to the west coast, from New York to San Francisco, but it has never been relevant in music or literature as the Route 66 has, because I'm sure that everyone knows Route 66. So how did you get to the Lincoln Highway, and what was appealing of this highway to you in order to turn it into, I would say, an additional character within your novel, although it acts like a ghost in a sense. It gives the ambience, a wonderful ambience. How did you get there?
if you've never heard about the Lincoln Highway, that's totally appropriate because most Americans have never heard of the Lincoln Highway. So you can forgive yourself immediately. But I had never heard of the Lincoln Highway. And I had this plan that my characters were going to leave the farm, and instead of going west to California, they'd go east to New York. And I knew in my notes, over a period of years, it said they would take Route X. That's the way they'd go. But I got to the point where I was writing the book, and I now needed to make a decision about the actual road they would take. And I took out a map of America, and I found the road that they would take on the map. And on the road, it says Route 30, in Nebraska. And then in small print, it says the road formerly known as the Lincoln Highway. And I thought, well, what is that? And I went and did, some investigation of it, and everything I learned about it was so terrific and crazy, I immediately knew that it needed to be at the center of the story in sort of a metaphorical way. And then the title of the book, I immediately changed all of the documents I had to call the book The Lincoln Highway. So what is it? Why do I think it was interesting as a road? And it's got layers of American mythology built into it. It was created in 1915, roughly, by an American entrepreneur, a guy named Carl Fisher, who had been born in the 1870s, poor, had made the equivalent of about $100 million in automotive parts at the beginning of the car. And then he sold his company. So he was rich and in a way bored, I guess. So he went on to do a variety of things as in his 30s and 40s that affected America, but the biggest was he felt that there should be a road that crossed the country. Now at the time, there was 2 million miles of roads in America, and 95% of them were dirt. They were not paved. And most of the roads were, like you'd imagine, were clustered, sort of spider webbing out from local towns or local cities in the vicinity. Roads are meant to get you from the town center to the houses in the vicinity. That's what roads are. Roads were not designed in America at the time to cross the country or to go long distances. That's what trains were for. And he thought, this is crazy. There should be a single road that is paved that goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. And he had a patriotic viewpoint, which was that he wanted to do that so Americans could see the country, their country. Now, driving across the country was so difficult in 1915 because there were also, imagine, in the middle of the country, no gas stations, no hotels, no garages. So when you drove across the country, you would take your gas, your water, repair parts, food, tents. It looked like a polar expedition when you would drive across the country. So in 1915, 150 people did it. That was it. So he decides when he's going to build this road, and he does it. He raises money from the public. He gets money from Teddy Roosevelt, from Thomas Edison, from the Boy Scouts, from citizens. He raises millions of dollars, and he oversees the building of the first paved road that goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Calls it the Lincoln Highway in honor of the President, Lincoln. And within 5 years, 20,000 Americans crossed the country every year. So this is a major change in the way that Americans are moving between the East Coast and California. And it is the most famous road in America by far in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. But then in the 1950s, Dwight David Eisenhower, the president, who had served in Europe in the Second World War, and who had seen the Autobahn in Germany, said, this is what we need in America. This is crazy. We need wide, high-speed highways that cover the entire country. So in the 1950s, they launched the building of a modern highway system in America. And as soon as they built it, the Lincoln Highway was obsolete. Now it still exists. It kind of looks like a country road. And you can drive it from Times Square in New York all the way to San Francisco. And it's only one lane in either direction. And long parts of it are just cornfields, So I loved all of this about it. as I say, because it's like an American mythos all built into it. Sort of the idea that an entrepreneur built it, that it was to serve this patriotic purpose, that it had great effect on the way people moved across the country, and then yet became obsolete and forgotten, because of the advance of the modern highway system. So for all those reasons, I thought it was very nice to have it right in the center of the story.
Mm-hmm. Bueno, pues
Well, we have some time for the readers to ask questions to Amor tonight. Do we have any questions in the audience?
A great visit. I'm kind of in the middle of the book. I'm listening to the audiobook. And so my question is, given all that's going on now in the U.S., could you give us some insight on how it was writing in the voice of a black man, one of your characters?
Sure.
And was there any special, insight into that? And how has the black community received your book?
I think there's a challenge implicit in everything that I'm doing, because as I described earlier, I'm constantly entering the personalities of other individuals, trying to inhabit their lives, and then trying to capture a voice that will be both true to the individual and sound true to the reader, that will bring the experience of that individual to life. Obviously, in recent years, yes, when you do that with a minority voice that has suffered isolation or silencing in American culture, it's become very political, and for very good reasons, right? Which is that the various communities, whether it's the Asian American community or the gay community or transvestite, whatever your realm, if you feel that your stories have not been represented in culture, and that others in power have taken over your stories and are telling them on your behalf, that is an unfair, unsustainable, imperfect situation. All of that, of course, is true. But it is equally true, in my opinion, that it is essential for writers, young or old, to make this effort to step into the lives of others, people that they are not. Mm-hmm. Because it is through this process of imagining that you are somebody else, trying to see the world through their eyes, that you begin to hopefully have, to broaden your own perspective. Mm-hmm. And to, as a result, enrich your work with not simply what you experienced, whoever you are, but you begin to try to give a glimpse of the world. And of course, this is why we read anybody. This is why we read Tolstoy, who's writing from, rich and poor and French and Russians and the conservatives and the liberals. He gets all in there. The whole world is in there. This is why we read Edith Wharton or Toni Morrison, because there's an enormous span of people. We can sense that life is what's happening in the course of somehow in between these books. And it doesn't work as well in a way if the author retreats to only speaking from their corner. There must be an effort to take a risk to some degree, to transport yourself and to reach out to others. So I do think it continues to be an important thing to do. Now, in the current climate, the stakes are raised, which is that if you get it wrong, you will hear about it quickly. So it means that you should do it with care. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It means that, you should think carefully about it. Now, I'll give you a little bit of example. Maybe I'm going on too long about this, but you as a writer have a lot of freedom, to imagine and to choose your angle on a narrative. So let's say I decide I want to write a story about a young Asian American boy in New York City. He's walking home and he gets beaten up on the way home. And there's a racial slur is exchanged when this happens. And he comes home and tells his mother, etc. Now, if I chose to tell the story from the perspective of that boy, I am taking on a significant challenge. right? One which I may feel up to, and I may go out and do. But suddenly I am putting myself in the perspective of this young Asian American who's been the victim of this prejudice, and I'm going to need to kind of know the whole world in which he lives in order to do justice to his story. But now I could also be the friend who's walking home with him and who discovers him a minute after he's been beaten up and gets him home, let's say. I could be the mother of the boy who's the friend, and we live across the hall in the apartment building. And so suddenly I am talking to the Asian mother, and my perspective is coming into contact with hers. I may be learning from her, what have you. But my point being that the event, you shouldn't, as an author, shy away from the event. Let's say of an Asian American boy being beaten up, let's say, if that's the story that you want to tell. But you should take a moment to ask yourself, what's my angle on this? Where do I feel comfortable, not politically, but artistically? Where do I feel comfortable in telling this tale? And so, like in the case of Rules of Civility, I told that story from the perspective of a working class woman in the 1930s. And I would not have written that book if I did not feel comfortable that I knew that young woman and I could tell the story from her perspective. And I'm glad to say that that book has been a bestseller thanks largely to women who are the largest readers of that work. And so yes, in the case of The Lincoln Highway, you have two black characters, one of whom we do hear from, and I love actually the Ulysses sections. I think that he's a great character. I mean, if I do say so myself. But have I gotten negative feedback on it? No. And and I think that's because it works for whatever reason, because he's fully imagined is what matters, I guess. And he has a voice which is very much his own. He's not serving the part of somebody else's story, so the white kid's story. We do hear his past, his concerns, his challenges, and we have a sense, we have an investment in the stakes of the life he's leading. This isn't really fair, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm proud of the fact that Obama put, The Lincoln Highway on the, list of books that he recommended to read this year, and that's a good test for me, because if he had felt like this, this had failed in this particular regard, I don't think he would have recommended it.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Any other question? We have still a few minutes. There's another one there, and this will take us to wrap this up.
The way you set the scenes, particularly in Gentlemen of Moscow, there are a lot of things I was wondering, is this stuff real?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And it's good to know that it wasn't just me that was wondering if it was. In Lincoln Highway, the character of the professor, I kind of flashed on the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
In some of that. And I don't know, was that intentional? Did you see him as somehow, not being a fraud, but in controlling some of the narrative around that? What did you intend for his function to be, if you will?
Yeah. No connection to the Wizard of Oz was intentional, but somebody else made that observation, and as soon as they did it, I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because there's a lot of parallels in the sense that Billy, the story really begins in Kansas. That's where Emmett is doing time when he's on his way home to pick up Billy in Nebraska, and then suddenly there's Billy with his sort of coterie going to see Abacus Abernathy, and of course Wizard of Oz Dorothy starts in Kansas, I should point out, and she goes to see the wizard, and as a young girl, and so that must have been in the back of my mind. I mean, I wasn't thinking about it, but as an archetype, I'm certainly familiar with it, having seen the movie a million times, right? And but what is the role of Abacus specifically? Is he sort of one way it's different in the Wizard of Oz is that in the Wizard of Oz, which is great, a fabulous movie. Part of the role the wizard plays is that, and this is a spoiler, but if you don't know the end of how the Wizard of Oz plays out, it's your own fault at this point. You know, it's almost 100 years old. But you know, the wizard is a con man in essence. But what happens is that, of course, he has this beautiful speech when everybody's come with their 4 different needs, asking the wizard for help. You know, the lion who wants courage, and the Tin Man who wants a heart, and Dorothy wants to go home. And then he gives this beautiful speech about saying, well, okay, it's true, I am a con man, but you know, the lion, you have courage. You could have it within yourself, and if you just did this and this, and Tin Man, you could have a heart too. And he kind of sort of brings out of them that which they wanted all along. This thing that they've been longing for and hunting. And of course, this is a beautiful sort of parable about human life, because for many of us, that's true. Right, the thing that we feel that we really wish we had, it's actually there, and that if we had the courage or the moment or the patience or the moment of insight, we could bring that out and fulfill ourselves in this way. What's sort of interesting about the abacus thing is that he is a storyteller. He's not a con man, really. He is a storyteller, and he's a genuine storyteller. But I think what kind of funny about it from the Wizard of Oz sense is it gets inverted here, which is that he's not the one who is giving Billy or Wooly or Duchess sort of the insight that they need to become who they want to be. It's the reverse in this case, which is that Billy actually does it to Abacus. And I won't tell you how that happens, but that's really what happens. You know, the innocence and wonder of Billy has this big influence on Abacus and changes the course of his life.
Mm-hmm.
Y una última pregunta que creo que tenemos.
A last question I think that we have over there.
Or explanations here. I'm not going to ask you a question on your books. It is a question on your person. Okay. I don't know if you have realized that your own name, it is Amor.
Yeah.
You have said that when you get older, you realize how your parents were and all the things that they did. Do you know, or do you imagine why they gave you this name to you? Okay. Because it's quite curious for me.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's funny. Yes, of course, my name means love in Latin and Spanish and versions of it in French and Italian, amore or amor, but originally all stemming from the Roman Latin. And it is true that in the Boston that I was growing up in, there was not as large an Hispanic community at the time that there is now. It was a town there was a large black community, a large Irish community, a large Italian community. There was not a big Hispanic community yet in the 70s. And so when I first moved to New York, it was really the first time, I guess, where I was interacting on a daily basis with Hispanic Americans. And so whenever I would, whether it was wherever, meeting somebody at a dinner or, going to the bank or whatever it would be, and I'd introduce myself. The Spanish American, Hispanic American woman would say, "Do you know what your name means?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, I know what my name means," but I would be asked that all the time, But one of the things that came out of that is that I don't know about here in Spain, but in Mexico, and I've been all through Central America and South America, there was no tradition of using Amor as a first name, none. And so they were always amazed by it, and they were like, "What a great name!" And I was always like, "You can use it, feel free, Okay, but so where did I get it? So it's a strange story, I guess, and it comes from the fact that my heritage, my roots, are in Puritan New England, so old Massachusetts from the 1700s, 1600s, and the Puritans who came to New England, from England and from Northern Europe, particularly I'm from Anglican background, they avoided naming their children after saints because they viewed that as a Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. So they wanted to differentiate themselves from the Catholics in the way that they name their children. So it was less common to name your child Mary or Maria, for instance, you know, which they really viewed as sort of a Catholic name, you know, or even, you know, John or Paul, etc. But what they started doing is naming their children after virtues. So it was quite common in old New England to call a woman, for instance, charity, or chastity, or prudence, or patience, which were all virtues. And so amor was, love in Latin, was a Christian virtue turned into a first name. So it's a name that has come down in my family over hundreds of years, and I've never met anybody other than a family member with that name.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Amor.
Well, thank you very much, Amor, for being with us today to present the Lincoln Highway. Thank you for bringing us to this enormous journey, and thank you everyone for being here today. We'll keep reading you.
Thank you.